From the William B. Travis Building in Austin, Texas, we're keeping Texas energy on track. Here's your host, Bryce Doobie.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us for the next episode of Texas Energy on Track, the official podcast of the Railroad Commission of Texas. I am your host, Bryce Doobie, and as always, I am joined by my co-host slash producer, Nick Cranock. Nick, how's it going?
Pretty good. You excited to be back here for episode number 4 now that we've been doing this. It's great. We've been rolling and hitting some pretty interesting topics, and I think another interesting one coming up today as well.
Absolutely. Just for a recap for our listeners, with our last episode, we were joined by Paul Dubois, and he's talked about produced water, sort of how that works and sort of the impacts and all those different things. And one of the things he alluded to during our conversation was seismicity and some of the impacts that that's having, particularly out in West Texas, which is why we are thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Aaron Velasco. He has a couple different titles. He is the state seismologist for the Railroad Commission, but I'm going to let him introduce himself. Sir, how are you doing today?
Good. It's nice to be here. I am currently serving as a state seismologist for the Railroad Commission, but I've had a long career. I've worked for different organizations. I've worked for Science Applications International Corporation. I've worked for Los Alamos National Lab. And currently I am a professor at the University of Texas at El Paso in the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Resource Sciences.
That is fantastic. So it sounds like we have the absolute right subject matter expert to be joining us. Full disclosure, my end, I have only taken Geology 101 and 102, so here to defer to your expertise on everything today. Just to kind of jump straight into this a little bit, like I said, we were talking about produced water before. When we hear about seismicity, it's kind of a broader term. I mean, most folks actually, being realistic, when we say that, we're talking earthquakes. What can you tell us as far as a general overview as far as what seismicity is?
So seismicity is generally a term that we use whenever there's an area that has earthquakes. And it turns out that in the state of Texas, there are natural earthquakes that occur. But most recently, in the last probably 10 years, we've seen an uptick in the number of earthquakes, and we believe it's related to oil and gas activity.
And so when we say oil and gas activity, I know with our conversations that we had on our previous episode, I mean, these are connected to some of that deep injection with the produced water and things like that. It's not necessarily, I'm drilling for oil, earthquake happens.
You know, that's a great question. Actually, the state of Texas has a lot of different examples of the type of seismicity that you can get. As I mentioned before, there's natural seismicity. And actually, whenever you generate an earthquake, I just want to point out something, and that is that whether you have, injected water into a fault and whether it slips or not, all that energy that's being released is natural. And what you've done is just basically weakened a fault that's storing that energy. So you're not really creating earthquakes, but what you can do is you can make faults weaker and through the injection process. But there's also other ways you can create earthquakes. And so you're talking about deep injection. What we're referring to that is that you're basically injecting salt water below the pay zone where they're hydraulic fracturing. When you get water that deep, we've discovered in some areas of Texas, not all areas, is that water seems to make its way, or the pressure makes its way down to the faults and triggers seismicity. But there's also other areas in Texas where shallow seismicity has occurred from shallow injection and actually the fracking process itself.
So different types in different locations. From my level, I assume that's just because of the different strengths of the formations in those areas and things like that?
Oh my goodness, that's the $10 million question. We think it's a result of we think the current orientation of the stress field is, and the orientations of the faults. And if they're oriented properly for that to be, I should say properly, but if they're oriented in a fashion that is related to the current stress field, they're more likely to slip. So what happens is that if you inject water into these faults, that's where you would essentially get earthquakes. There's other areas, other faults that wouldn't trigger necessarily because they're not optimally oriented to the current stress field. And what I mean, that sounds really technical, but what we're dealing with right now is especially West Texas, we have a bunch of ancient faults that formed, and the formation of the continent itself probably. That's how old they are, which makes them over 1 billion years old. And what's happening, and some of them are probably younger than that, but it's a general zone that has become active, and that's because the faults are oriented to what the current stress field is. And the fascinating part of this is that the stress field is different in many respects And so these faults are really planes of weakness. And what happens is that once you orientate those faults in the planes of weakness and you inject water, it basically, what we call, advances the earthquake cycle. And so they've just been sitting there happy as could be for, a long, long time. And the injection has disturbed that, and it's creating earthquakes.
So basically what you're saying, I think, it maybe, I don't know if this is a $5 million or a $20 million question here, is what you're saying is we've basically awakened sleeping giants, because if I'm not mistaken, every state in the United States has faults, and most of them, you typically think of earthquakes and stuff on the West Coast, but this could happen basically anywhere. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that's, again, you're right on. I mean, I think in many respects, what we've discovered is that there's a lot of faults everywhere. And it just so happens if you disturb those guys that have been sleeping for quite some time, you can advance that cycle and create earthquakes.
We have this understanding on how these seismic events are occurring and things, and we know that, like you said, there's deep and shallow and all of that. What sort of research is going into getting that understanding? Like, what are we learning when we're kind of looking into all of this?
But we rely on peer-reviewed publications, and what that means is basically scientists that write a journal article, say about induced seismicity in Texas, and that's reviewed by experts, and then it's eventually published in a scientific journal. We rely on that. And the tough thing for us has been these West Texas earthquakes, because if you have a well generally by a fault and it's injecting, you can shut off that well. And if you think that that's the well that's causing the earthquakes, and generally the system shuts down. So once you stop adding that fluid and pressure, the system shuts down. But in West Texas, we had wells that were very far away from the earthquakes. Earthquakes started in 2020 out there, and it took quite a few years to understand what exactly was happening. And what we believe is happening and what's being published now is that these wells in West Texas were on the order of miles. I mean, they're 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 25, 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers away from where the earthquakes are going. And we believe that process has taken us a long time to wrap our arms around. We believe that that's now the controlling factor for the earthquakes out in West Texas. Now, there's other areas we've had in the state where we've had a single well inject into a sweet spot, I guess, and create earthquakes right away. And we've had to, address that almost immediately. But this system was probably technically the most challenging to try to wrap our arms around.
I do know, and I know folks who follow this issue, that we do have some specific response areas within the state where we aren't doing any more injections, or the seismic response areas or SRAs. Well, can you tell us a little bit about that, and how that sort of works?
So what you're referring to is an area that we designate called the Seismic Response Area, or SRA, where we try to address the seismicity in that area. As we've developed this, we've actually worked hand in hand with industry. They've developed, many times they'll develop what we call an operator-led response plan, and we review that and say if this is good or not. We've done individual responses in certain areas, and in some cases, like in Midland area, we did a complete shut-in of deep injectors, and the seismicity essentially turned off. In a sense, that particular area, which had a lot of earthquakes, it was shaking the people of Midland and Odessa, has essentially turned off for now. And we're pretty happy about that. There's other areas of the state. North of that, we have what we call a Stanton SRA, which is near Midland also, but to the northeast of Midland. That area has had a very strong operator-led group, and they developed a decision tree that we've endorsed. And we've gone through that process of decision tree, and eventually we're getting to the point where most of the wells in that area, some of them are indeed shut in based on their own criteria, and we're looking to probably have to continue to curtail deep injection in that specific area. So every area is different. The SRA in West Texas is the one I was referring to earlier, and that was eventually we had a series of magnitude 5s that essentially forced our hand to basically say we have to shut you in. We've had really good experiences with industry where they want to do the right thing, we want to do the right thing. We understand the financial implications of what's happening, but at the same time, they're citizens of Texas too, and so we find that in most cases, industry has been really amenable, sometimes doesn't agree with us, but at least will work with us to try to figure out a solution. So it's been an important collaboration, an important sort of working the problem.
If underground injection has been occurring in Texas for a long time, I think from the late 1930s in terms of liquid waste disposal, how come this has been more of an issue lately compared to just, over the previous decades and decades of this occurring? Is it because frequency's increasing, or is there an easy answer to that question?
There is actually a fairly easy answer. First of all, deep injection hasn't been widely done. It's usually shallow injection that's occurred. And when you get deep, you're getting closer to the fault. The other side of that is the sheer amount of volume of water that's being injected now is not even close to what was being injected way back in the day. The volume is just, the activity right now and the sheer volume, and as you mentioned before about the produced water, where do you put all that water if you're producing, from these formations? And so the sheer volume alone is a magnitudes different than in the past. So we have deep injection, large volumes.
Thinking on that same note, we have a fairly proactive approach in working with industry, and from what you were saying, they're getting some results, and we see tangible things. Is this something information that we're able to then share with other states or federal partners? And if so, what's been sort of the response from them on these things? Because it sounds like we're really kind of trying to stay ahead of this as best one can.
Yeah, it's a great, every state regulates their own way. And so when I first came on board, I visited Oklahoma, for example, to see what they were doing. And, we're not Oklahoma, we're Texas. And so our commissioners were definitely wanting to do things the Texas way in some respects. And that would be just come up with our own solutions, working with industry and whatnot. And so I think a lot of what we've been able to develop here has been an example in many respects for other states. And I think, for example, New Mexico, we collaborate with them on occasion, let them know this is what we've done. We share information that way. This is how we permit, wells in areas of seismicity. We have a whole procedure for that. We review permits on a weekly basis in areas of seismicity. We review the SRAs. We meet with industry collaborators. And so it's really a collaboration. And sometimes New Mexico will go to, for example, some of our meetings. They go to the scientific meetings, and certainly we have open discussion with industry partners and whatnot. So I think in many respects we've developed our own ways, and we're always open to share. And there's another thing about understanding the depth of earthquakes is actually kind of an ugly secret in seismology, is that normally we can't determine depth very well. And that becomes a really factor if you're doing deep injection or shallow injection. But as we've continued on, we separated the process of deep and shallow. And then now we're recognizing that, well, with shallow, larger earthquakes aren't probably going to happen as a result of shallow injection. They can occur, but generally our experience is that we haven't had anything even as large as a 3.5 from shallow injection. And meanwhile, we're getting magnitude 5s from deep injection. So we've learned. And so what are the issues with shallow injection now are actually not necessarily seismicity. They're more related to pressure and overpressuring these formations. So as we've evolved, we've been able to address that openly. And I think that's you see the new guidelines or whatnot. It all relates to us understanding what the issues are, trying to adjust to industry needs, but also recognizing what the hazards are associated with both shallow and deep injection.
When we're, I guess, sort of talking about these different, you were saying with the magnitudes there, like a 3 versus a 5. I lived in Japan years ago. I know I've felt some earthquakes in my life. What are we when we're saying like a magnitude 5? Like that's something that sounds like a mark on like where you're tracking things to keep an eye on. Like what are we talking about when we say something like that?
Typically, a 5 won't do maybe minor damage near the epicenter, but those magnitude 5s are being felt all the way out here in El Paso, and it pretty much can be very unsettling for people. So those are the magnitudes that you don't necessarily want. We've had a series of earthquakes. Faults seem to be active. Some of them are large faults. And if a large fault were to rupture at one time, it could generate a large earthquake. So that's where we don't want to get.
So what are we telling folks who live in these active zones? I mean, I would imagine this is different from if you're in the Ring of Fire or in the San Andreas or something like that. But what are the things for someone who's listening and they live out in those areas or they have family or friends out in those areas? What do they need to know about, sort of what we're telling folks in regards to seismicity?
The big thing, like I said, I think it's always good to be prepared, know what to do during an earthquake. There is a very nice drill that's given once a year. It's called the Great Shakeout, and I've really promoted this heavily in El Paso. And partly is to make people aware of what to do during an earthquake, and also just to be aware, like if you travel to earthquake country, and I know a lot of people here, for example, travel to California for a vacation, so you need to be, what do you do during an earthquake? And so it's a matter of just getting the word out that earthquakes do happen, and that to be as prepared as we can be, and that in itself will save lives. The whole idea here, though, from our perspective, is we don't want anything damaging, no damaging earthquakes. And when you get above a 5.5, that starts to damage infrastructure. It just depends on the infrastructure, what's vulnerable and what's not.
Are we at a point at all where we need to think about building structures differently? I know there's the earthquake-proof buildings in areas that have the bigger earthquakes, like in California, Japan. Do we need to start thinking about that? Or is there a way that with the deep injection, we can get a handle on doing it where we're not creating bigger earthquakes?
Like I said before, we don't necessarily know what the largest magnitude can be triggered. Also, a lot of buildings, at least in Texas and West Texas, the modern buildings are built to wind shear. And I think that itself helps out in cases of earthquakes. So, whenever you see, I always tell people, if you ever travel through West Texas, beautiful country, there's mountains, and the mountains are created by faults. And so whenever you see an active area, usually you have hills and you have valleys. And that it means that you always have a chance for an earthquake.
I mean, just sort of with what you see going on, what do you see as far as the future in regards to seismicity in Texas?
Well, the future really depends on our ability to handle the water. And I think that that's the big issue. It's not necessarily actually earthquakes. It's basically what can be done to handle all this volume of water. What do we do then? And I think that's the challenge in front of us as an industry, as the state of Texas.
And following up on that, is the RRC going to, or are we limiting saltwater disposal well permits to reduce that seismic activity at all?
So we have a whole process, as I mentioned before, of permitting in areas of seismicity. So we do limit the amount you can inject in an area if there's earthquakes. We rate basically the well risk in some respects of contributing to seismicity and base a volume of injection on that risk.
In June of this year, some additional guidelines for the Permian Basin went into effect, particularly in related to permits for saltwater disposal within that region. So, I mean, I know they're taking a look at an expanded area of review around the injection sites, limits on maximum pressure based on some of those geologic properties like you were mentioning earlier with with those formations and their strength, and then limits on the amount that actually can be put in based on that same reservoir pressure. So I know that we are taking a look at different actions, again, remaining proactive and working, like I said, working with industries and communities out there.
The motive behind those changes are essentially learning as we go and learning more information and getting solid science and making decisions based on the best science that we have available, recognizing that the science isn't perfect and we don't know everything that's going on at depth. And it's a tough call, but at the same time, we have learned, we continue to learn, and that's reflected in changes that we make.
And I think that's a really good point, just showing that this is again sort of a dynamic situation as you said, we learn more about what's going to be going on in the future with the science and all these things and continue to move forward on things. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really informative topic. I know this is one that a lot of folks have a lot of interest in. I really appreciate your time with you just participating in this conversation.
Yeah, I think we can just get into so many just off-topic discussions just about plate tectonics and Texas and everything like that. I don't think I have anything else to add. I'm just surprised at the amount I've learned just during this episode that we need to do a part 2, I think. Especially because we're learning a lot as we're in this process of trying to reduce those numbers of earthquakes out there in West Texas.
And the science will change. That's the one thing I can guarantee you. The science will change. And so we have great colleagues at the Bureau of Economic Geology that really we've worked closely with also not just industry alone. And it's really that sort of collaboration across all those different organizations that really will move the needle and allow us to at least address injection in the state of Texas.
Well, thank you once again for joining us today. And thank you everyone out there for tuning in and listening. This is, as always, Texas Energy on Track, the official podcast of the Railroad Commission of Texas. You can find us online a couple different places. I know I normally can hand this off to Nick and you can tell us where that is.
We are on X, that's TXRRC, on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. Just search Railroad Commission of Texas. All of our accounts have the check marks. So if you want to follow along on social media, not just what's going on with the podcast, but what the commission is doing, what the agency is doing, follow along on your favorite.
And you can always, as usual, find us on our website at www.rrc.texas.gov.
Another great place to find that information. And then coming up on Texas Energy on Track, in our next episode, we're going to be looking at inspections, what goes on specifically with our critical infrastructure division, kind of a background of how that evolved, where we formed that division from, and then what are inspectors doing during the winter and summer inspections, what they look for, and what the critical natural gas facilities have been doing to prepare for the winter season as well as the summer season. So I think another great episode coming up in October.
I'm really looking forward to it. Once again, thank y'all for tuning in, and we'll talk to y'all soon.